The swirling dust, devils danced like mocking spirits across the parched earth, mirroring the turmoil in Winona's heart. 3 men, faces etched with greed and sun, circled her wagon like vultures eyeing carrion. Her 3 children, barely old enough to walk, clung to her skirt, their wide eyes reflecting the menace in the air. Caleb watched from the ridge, his weathered face unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. Had seen this scene played out too many times on the unforgiving plains, the strong preying on the vulnerable, the land swallowing the dreams of the hopeful. Winona stood defiant, her chin lifted against the onslaught of their words. They spoke of debts, of her late husband's failings, of the land now rightfully theirs. Their words were like barbed wire, tearing at the fragile hope she had clung to since his passing. She knew the truth, the insidious way these men operated, twisting legalities into weapons. Her husband, a good man trying to scratch a living from unforgiving soil, had borrowed against a future he wouldn't see. Now, they were here to collect, and she was the payment. The smallest of her children, a boy with eyes like polished obsidian, began to cry. Winona pulled him closer, her hand instinctively reaching for the worn knife tucked into her waistband. A desperate act, but a mother's love knew no bounds. Caleb felt a familiar ache in his chest, a ghost of his own past echoing in her plight. He hadn't spoken a word in weeks, the silence a shield against the memories that haunted him. But some things he knew couldn't be ignored. He touched the worn handle of his Colt Peacemaker. The dust devils continued their dance, oblivious to the storm brewing within him. He started down the ridge, a lone figure against the vast, unforgiving landscape. Each step was a silent promise, a reckoning long overdue. The youngest boy's cry pierced the simmering tension, a fragile sound against the backdrop of the harsh land. Winona's grip tightened on the knife, a futile defense against the inevitable. Caleb descended the ridge, his shadow lengthening, a silent promise etched in the deepening furrows of his face. He remembered another woman, another cry. Sarah, thought Tor, his wife. The Comanches had come like a summer storm, swift and brutal. Had been out hunting, chasing a buck for what felt like a lifetime. Had returned to find the cabin smoldering, Sarah gone. The memory was a brand seared into his soul. He hadn't spoken since. Not a word. The men hadn't noticed him yet, too focused on their prey. They were circling Winona, their voices laced with a cruel patience. Just sign the paper, ma'am, one drawled, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. Save yourself, and the young uns some trouble. Winona's eyes, though filled with fear, held a spark of defiance. She wouldn't break. Not yet. She glanced at her husband's freshly turned grave, a mound of red earth marked by a rough-hewn wooden cross. He deserved better than this. They all did. Caleb reached the wagon. The dust settled around him, clinging to his warm coat. He stood silent, a sentinel against the encroaching darkness. The men finally turned, their faces shifting from predatory to wary. You got business here, old man? The one who'd spoken before asked, his hand instinctively moving towards his holster. Caleb didn't answer. He simply stared, his eyes, the color of weathered steel, boring into the man. He reached into his own coat, the movement slow and deliberate. The air crackled with unspoken threat. He didn't draw his gun. Instead, he pulled out a small, worn Bible. He walked past the man, ignoring his sputtering protests, and knelt beside Winona. He opened the Bible, his calloused thumbs smoothing the worn pages. He found the passage he was looking for, a verse about loss and redemption. He couldn't speak it aloud, but he pointed to the words, his finger tracing the familiar lines. Winona looked at him, confusion warring with a flicker of understanding in her eyes. He wanted her to know she wasn't alone. That even in this desolate place, there was something. The men shifted uneasily. This wasn't the confrontation they'd expected. This wasn't a fight they knew how to win. Caleb rose, his gaze sweeping over them. A silent challenge. He nodded towards the grave. It needed tending. He started to gather loose stones, placing them carefully on the mound. A simple act of respect. A promise. Winona watched him, her grip loosening on the knife. Maybe, just maybe, there was a glimmer of hope in this desolate land after all. The smallest boy reached out and touched Caleb's leg. Caleb looked down at him, his eyes softening. He picked up another stone, a small smooth one, and placed it in the boy's hand. The boy smiled, a fragile, hopeful smile. The dance of the dust devils seemed to slow, the mocking spirits momentarily subdued. Caleb continued placing stones, each one a small act of defiance, a monument to a life stolen too soon. The men, unnerved by his silent presence and the unsettling display of piety, shifted their weight, their earlier bravado fading like a desert mirage. The Bible, the stones, the quiet dignity of the man. It was a language they didn't understand, a threat they couldn't quantify. The leader, a man named Barlow, finally cleared his throat. "All right, old-timer," he said, his voice losing its edge. "We ain't looking for trouble. Just business." He glanced at Winona, then back at Caleb. Maybe we can work something out." He knew he was beaten, at least for now. Caleb's silence was a force field, impenetrable and unnerving. He signaled to his men, and they reluctantly mounted their horses. "We'll be back, widow," Barlow said, a hint of menace still lingering in his voice. "Don't think you've seen the last of us." They rode off, leaving Winona and her children, alone with Caleb. The dust they kicked up swirled and settled, coating everything in a fine red film. The sun beat down mercilessly, the heat radiating off the parched earth. Winona watched them go, her relief tempered by a deep-seated fear. They would be back. She knew it. She looked at Caleb, his face still unreadable, his gaze fixed on the grave. He was a strange man, a silent sentinel. But he had stood between her and the wolves, and for that she was grateful. She approached him cautiously, her children clinging to her skirts. "Thank you," she said, her voice hoarse. I don't know what you did, but thank you." Caleb didn't respond. He simply nodded, his eyes still focused on the grave. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, smooth stone, identical to the one he had given the boy. He placed it on the grave, a silent offering. Winona saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a deep, unspeakable sorrow. She understood then that he wasn't just protecting her, he was fighting his own demons, a battle waged in silence and solitude. The land around them was barren, cracked and dry. The drought had been relentless, choking the life out of everything. Her husband's crops had withered and died, leaving him with nothing but debt. Now, the land itself seemed to be conspiring against her. She looked at her children, their faces gaunt with hunger and worry. She had to find a way to survive, to provide for them. But the odds were stacked against her. She was a widow with 3 young children, alone in a desolate land, with men like Barlow circling like vultures. That night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Winona sat beside the fire, her children asleep beside her. Caleb sat a short distance away, his back to the fire, his silhouette a dark outline against the fading light. He was a constant presence, a silent guardian. She wondered about him, about his past, about the sorrow that seemed to cling to him like the dust to his coat. She knew he wouldn't speak, but she felt a connection to him, a shared understanding of loss and hardship. The wind whispered through the dry grass, a mournful sound that echoed the emptiness in her heart. She looked up at the stars, countless and indifferent, scattered across the vast black canvas of the night. She felt small and insignificant, lost in the immensity of the universe. But she also felt a flicker of hope, a stubborn refusal to give up. She would survive. The fire crackled, spitting embers into the inky sky. Winona watched them fade, mirroring her own hopes flickering against the harsh reality of her situation. Caleb remained a silent sentinel, his presence a comfort and a mystery. She knew Barlow would return. It was only a matter of time. The youngest boy stirred in his sleep, whimpering softly. Winona pulled him closer, her hand stroking his brow. He was too young to understand the danger they were in, the vultures circling, waiting for them to falter. Caleb shifted, the leather of his saddle creaking softly in the stillness. He had been watching her, she knew, his eyes, though unreadable, conveying a sense of unwavering vigilance. Finally, he stirred, the silence broken by the scrape of his boot against the dry earth. He stood, his tall frame silhouetted against the dying embers. He walked towards her, his movements slow and deliberate, each step measured. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze sweeping over her and the sleeping children. For the first time since she had seen him on the ridge, he spoke. His voice was low and gravelly, unused, like a rusted hinge, protesting after years of disuse. "Ranch," he rasped, the single word hanging in the air. Winona looked up at him, confusion etched on her face. "Ranch?" she echoed, unsure of his meaning. He nodded, his eyes fixed on hers. "Mine. Shelter." He gestured vaguely to the west, towards the setting sun. "Safe." Winona's heart skipped a beat. Shelter. Safety. No. The words were like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. But she hesitated. She knew nothing about this man, this silent stranger who had appeared out of nowhere. Was he truly offering help? Or was this another trap, another form of exploitation disguised as kindness? She looked at her children, their innocent faces vulnerable and trusting. She had to protect them, to make the right choice. But she was weary, worn down by grief and fear. The thought of facing Barlow again, of fighting for survival on her own, was almost unbearable. She asked, her voice barely a whisper, "Why would you do this?" Caleb's expression remained unchanged. He didn't offer an explanation, didn't offer platitudes or empty promises. He simply met her gaze, his eyes holding a depth of sorrow that resonated with her own. He understood loss. He understood desperation. He pointed again to the west, the gesture more insistent this time. "Barlow, come back. Ranch, strong. Help." Winona considered his offer, weighing the risks against the potential rewards. She had nothing to lose. Staying here meant certain ruin, a slow and agonizing death. Going with him, it was a gamble, a leap of faith into the unknown. But it was a gamble she was willing to take. She nodded slowly, her decision made. "Well, go," she said, her voice stronger now, infused with a newfound resolve. "Well, go with you." Caleb simply nodded in return, his silence a promise of protection. A silent vow to stand between her and the darkness that threatened to engulf her. He turned and began to pack his meager belongings, his movements efficient and purposeful. He didn't speak again, but his actions spoke volumes. He was a man of few words, but he was a man of his word. And in this harsh and unforgiving land, that was worth more than all the gold in California. The first rays of dawn painted the sky in pale hues of pink and gold as they prepared to leave. Winona gathered their few possessions, stuffing them into the back of the wagon. The children, still half asleep, clung to her skirts, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement. Caleb hitched his horse to the front of the wagon, his movements economical and practiced. He checked the wheels, tightened the straps, ensuring everything was secure. He was a man accustomed to hard work, to the demands of the land. As they pulled away from the grave, Winona could help but look back. The mound of red earth stood stark against the horizon, a reminder of her loss, of the life she had left behind. A tear trickled down her cheek, a silent farewell to her husband, to her dreams. The journey was slow and arduous. The wagon bumped and rattled over the uneven terrain, the dust swirling around them in choking clouds. The sun beat down mercilessly, baking the earth and draining their energy. Winona watched Caleb closely, studying his every move. He was a closed book, his thoughts and feelings hidden behind a wall of silence. She wondered what had driven him to this desolate place, what had caused the deep sorrow she saw in his eyes. The children, sensing her unease, remained quiet and subdued. They huddled together in the back of the wagon, their faces pale and drawn. The youngest boy, little Thomas, coughed frequently, his breath rattling in his chest. As the day wore on, Winona's suspicion began to give way to a grudging respect. Caleb was a tireless worker, his strength and endurance seemingly endless. He navigated the treacherous terrain with ease, his instincts guiding them through the wilderness. He shared his meager rations with them, ensuring the children had enough to eat. That evening, they made camp beside a small stream, the water a welcome sight after the long, dry day. Caleb built a fire, his movements efficient and precise. Winona prepared a simple meal of beans and dried meat, the aroma filling the air. As they ate, a comfortable silence settled between them. Winona watched Caleb, his face illuminated by the flickering flames. She saw the lines etched around his eyes, the deep furrows in his brow, the marks of a life lived hard. She sensed a kindred spirit, a fellow traveler on the road of sorrow. Later, as the children slept, Winona sat beside the fire, her thoughts swirling in her head. She looked at Caleb, who was sitting a short distance away, his back to the fire, his gaze fixed on the stars. She knew he wouldn't speak, but she felt compelled to break the silence. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely audible above the crackling of the fire. "For everything." Caleb didn't respond. He simply nodded, his eyes still fixed on the heavens. Winona hesitated, then spoke again. I know what it's like to lose someone," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "To feel like your world has been shattered." Caleb finally turned, his eyes meeting hers. For a moment she saw a flicker of recognition in his gaze, a shared understanding of pain. He didn't speak, but she knew he understood. He had seen her grief, felt her desperation. He had recognized a kindred spirit in her, a fellow survivor in a world of loss. And in that moment a fragile bond formed between them, a connection forged in the crucible of shared sorrow. The journey continued, each day a test of endurance, each night a fragile truce with the vast, uncaring wilderness. Winona observed Caleb, the man of granite and silence, searching for any glimpse of the man beneath. Small kindnesses, almost imperceptible, began to surface, like hidden springs in the arid landscape. Head mended tear in little Sarah's dress with rough, calloused fingers, his brow furrowed in concentration. Head offered Thomas, still plagued by a cough, the warmest spot by the fire, wrapping him in his worn blanket without a word. These weren't grand gestures, but they were enough. Enough to thaw the icy shell of Winona's fear, enough to let a sliver of hope pierce the darkness. She started anticipating these small acts, finding herself watching him, not with suspicion but with a hesitant curiosity. One evening, as they camped near a dry creek bed, Caleb disappeared for a short while. Winona, initially worried, scanned the horizon, her hand instinctively reaching for the rifle. He returned moments later, carrying a handful of wildflowers, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the muted browns and grays of the surrounding desert. He wordlessly placed them near where Sarah and little Beth were playing, a silent offering to their childish joy. Sarah, her face lighting up, picked one of the flowers, a bright yellow bloom. She ran to Caleb, holding it out to him. He hesitated for a moment, then gently took the flower, his large hand dwarfing the delicate petals. He looked at Sarah, a ghost of a smile flickering across his lips. It was a fleeting moment, gone before Winona could fully register it, but it was there. A crack in the stone, revealing the man beneath. Later that night, Winona found herself drawn to the fire, unable to sleep. She sat beside Caleb, the silence between them no longer oppressive, but almost companionable. The stars blazed overhead, indifferent to their small dramas, their silent struggles. "They miss their pa," Winona said, her voice soft, almost a whisper. "He was a good man." Caleb remained silent, his gaze fixed on the flames. He wasn't always good at farming," she continued, her voice cracking with emotion. "But he loved them. He tried." Caleb shifted, and for the first time, Winona felt he was truly listening, not just tolerating her presence. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small whittled wooden horse. It was rough, unfinished, but clearly made with care. He held it out to her. "For Thomas," he rasped, his voice still a rusty whisper. Winona took the toy, her fingers tracing the rough edges. It was a simple thing, a small act of kindness, but it spoke volumes. It was a promise, a gesture of hope, a sign that even in the harshest of landscapes, kindness could still bloom. The silent rancher, with his hidden depths, was slowly chipping away at the scars on her heart. The carved horse warmed Winona's hand, a tangible symbol of Caleb's quiet generosity. Thomas, when he awoke, clutched it like a lifeline, his coughing momentarily forgotten in the joy of a simple toy. But the fragile peace they'd found was about to be shattered. Word travels fast in the West, carried on the wind, whispered in saloons, etched on the faces of passing strangers. And the word about Winona, the widow with the triplets, traveling with the silent rancher, was spreading like wildfire. It wasn't just sympathy that fueled the gossip, it was something far more insidious: resentment. The neighboring ranchers, already struggling with the harsh conditions and dwindling resources, saw Winona as a burden, a drain on their community. They whispered about her husband's debts, conveniently forgetting the circumstances of his death. They muttered about her inability to provide for her children, conveniently ignoring the fact that she was doing everything in her power to survive. And most venomously, they spoke of her land, the fertile acres that her husband had carved out of the wilderness, the land that now, in their twisted logic, was rightfully theirs. The whispers soon turned to open hostility. When Winona and Caleb stopped at the trading post in the small town of Dust Creek for supplies, they were met with cold stares and curt service. The shopkeeper, a burly man with a handlebar mustache, doubled the price of flour and beans, claiming a shortage. "Heard you're traveling with a benefactor," he sneered, his eyes raking over Caleb, who stood silently near the door. "Taking advantage of the kindness of strangers, are we?" Winona flushed, her hand instinctively reaching for her purse. "I'll pay what I owe," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "And what about what you owe us, widow?" A voice called from the back of the store. A group of men, their faces hardened by years of toil and prejudice, emerged from the shadows. They were Barlow's kind, men who saw weakness as an invitation, and Winona, in their eyes, was the weakest of all. The air crackled with unspoken threats, the promise of violence hanging heavy in the dusty room. Caleb remained a statue, but Winona saw the subtle shift in his posture, the barely perceptible tightening of his jaw. He was ready, and so was she. The incident at the trading post was a warning, a shot across the bow. Winona knew, with a chilling certainty, that it was only a matter of time before the resentment simmering in Dust Creek boiled over. She tried to ignore the gnawing fear, focusing on the daily tasks of survival, but the weight of it pressed down on her, stealing her sleep and poisoning her waking hours. Caleb, as always, remained an enigma. He hadn't spoken a word about the encounter, but his actions spoke volumes. He started patrolling the perimeter of their camp at night, his rifle never far from his hand. He taught Winona how to shoot, patiently guiding her through the mechanics of loading, aiming, and firing. She was a quick learner, her fear fueling her determination. Then came the stolen spring. Winona's small plot of land, though fertile, relied on a single precious spring for irrigation. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep her crops alive, enough to feed her children. One morning she woke to find the spring dry, the trickle of water reduced to a muddy stain. Panic seized her. Without water, her crops would wither, and they would starve. She followed the dry creek bed upstream, her heart pounding with dread. A few miles away she found the source of the problem. A crude dam, built of rocks and mud, diverted the water into a newly dug irrigation ditch, leading towards the sprawling fields of a neighboring ranch. She recognized the brand on the cattle grazing nearby Barlow's. Fury, cold and sharp, replaced her fear. She marched towards the ranch house, her jaws set, her eyes blazing. She found Barlow sitting on his porch, a fat cigar clenched between his teeth, his gaze fixed on his newly irrigated fields. He saw her coming, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. "Mornin', widow," he drawled, tipping his hat. "Admiring my handiwork?" "You stole my water," Winona said, her voice trembling with anger. "You're trying to starve me and my children." Barlow chuckled, a low guttural sound. Now, widow, don't go making accusations. Just improving my land, making it more productive. Besides," he added, his eyes hardening, "a woman alone can't possibly work that land. It's just going to waste. Maybe you should consider selling it." Winona stood her ground, her hands clenched into fists. "That land is my children's inheritance," she said, her voice ringing with defiance. "And I won't let you steal it." Barlow rose, his bulk casting a shadow over her. "You're a fool, widow," he said, his voice laced with menace. "You can't fight progress. You can't fight me." He gestured towards the fields, the water shimmering in the sunlight. "This is the future, widow, and you're not a part of it." Winona turned and walked away, her head held high, her heart filled with a burning resolve. She knew she couldn't fight Barlow alone. But she wasn't alone. She had Caleb. And Caleb, she suspected, was about to make a choice. Winona didn't speak a word of her encounter with Barlow. She didn't need to. Caleb saw it in the set of her jaw, the haunted look in her eyes, the way she clutched the rifle a little tighter as she went about her chores. He knew Barlow had crossed the line. He could smell it in the air, thick and heavy like a brewing storm. That evening, after the triplets were asleep, Caleb saddled his horse. Winona watched him, her face etched with worry. "Where are you going?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Caleb didn't meet her gaze. He adjusted the cinch on his saddle, his movements deliberate, precise. "To Dust Creek," he rasped, his voice as rough as gravel. "Barlow's men are there," Winona said, her voice rising in alarm. "It's a trap." Caleb finally looked at her, his eyes like chips of flint. "I know." He swung into the saddle, the leather creaking under his weight. Before he turned his horse, he looked at her again, a flicker of something akin to concern in his gaze. "Stay here. Protect the children," he said, his voice barely audible. Then, without another word, he spurred his horse into the darkness, the sound of its hooves fading into the vast emptiness of the night. Winona watched him go, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew what Caleb was going to do. He was going to confront Barlow, to settle the score in the only way he knew how, with steel and silence. She prayed he wouldn't be walking into a slaughter. She knew the odds were stacked against him. Barlow had men, guns, and the weight of the community behind him. Caleb had only his skill, his courage, and his unwavering sense of justice. The hours crawled by, each tick of the clock an eternity. Winona sat by the fire, the rifle across her lap, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She jumped at every sound, her nerves stretched taut. She imagined Caleb facing Barlow, the clash of steel, the crack of gunfire. She pictured him lying wounded, or worse, dead in the dusty streets of Dust Creek. Finally, as the first rays of dawn painted the sky, she heard the sound of a horse approaching. Her heart leaped into her throat. She grabbed the rifle, her hands shaking, and waited. The rider emerged from the darkness, silhouetted against the rising sun. It was Caleb. He rode slowly, his head bowed, his shoulders slumped. He looked weary, defeated, but he was alive. As he drew closer, Winona saw something else. He wasn't alone. Tied behind his horse, their hands bound, were two men. She recognized them instantly, Barlow's right-hand men, the ones who had threatened her in the trading post. Caleb reined in his horse in front of her, his gaze meeting hers. "They won't bother you again," he said, his voice flat, emotionless. He dismounted, untied the men, and shoved them towards the road leading away from her land. They stumbled, cursed, but didn't dare resist. The fear in their eyes was palpable. They knew they had crossed the wrong man. Caleb turned back to Winona, his face unreadable. He didn't explain what had happened in Dust Creek. He didn't boast or brag. He simply looked at her, his gaze steady and unwavering. "The water will flow again," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Then, without another word, he turned and walked towards the spring, the rifle slung over his shoulder, his silhouette a stark outline against the rising sun. Winona watched him go. Winona watched him go, the dust swirling around his boots, a silent promise hanging in the air. The water would flow again. Head made sure of it. Relief washed over her, followed by a bone-deep exhaustion. She watched Caleb work at the spring, clearing the debris, his movements economical and sure. He was a force of nature, this man of few words, a silent guardian in a land that offered little protection. The triplets, roused by the commotion, toddled out of the makeshift lean-to shed rigged from canvas and branches. Thomas, still clutching the carved horse, pointed at Caleb and babbled something unintelligible. Hope flickered in Winona's chest, a fragile bloom in the barren landscape of her life. Maybe, just maybe, they could find a measure of peace here, a chance to rebuild. But the West was a harsh mistress, and peace was a fleeting visitor. The retribution came under the cloak of darkness. Winona was asleep, curled around the triplets for warmth, the rifle close at hand. Caleb was nowhere to be seen, likely patrolling the perimeter, his senses honed to the slightest disturbance. The crackling woke her. At first, she thought it was the campfire, but the smell was wrong, acrid, sharp, like burning pine. She bolted upright, her eyes widening in horror. Flames licked at the canvas of their lean-to, casting grotesque shadows that danced and writhed. "Caleb!" She screamed, her voice hoarse with terror. She scrambled to her feet, grabbing the triplets and dragging them towards the open air. The heat was intense, the smoke thick and choking. The canvas collapsed around them, showering them with sparks. Outside, the night air was cold and sharp, a stark contrast to the inferno behind her. She coughed, her lungs burning, her eyes streaming. The triplets wailed, their faces smudged with soot, their small bodies trembling with fear. Then she saw them, silhouetted against the flames, riding away into the darkness, were three figures on horseback. She recognized the build of one of the horses, the way it carried its head. It was one of Barlow's men, the one with the scar on his cheek. Rage, raw and untamed, surged through her. They hadn't just stolen her water, they had tried to kill her and her children. They had taken everything. She sank to her knees, the triplets clinging to her, the heat of the fire searing her skin. The lean-to was gone, reduced to a pile of smoldering embers. Their meager possessions, their blankets, their food, all consumed by the flames. They had nothing left. A guttural cry escaped her lips, a sound of pure, unadulterated despair. She looked up at the vast, indifferent sky, the stars glittering like cold, distant diamonds. She was alone, helpless, at the mercy of a cruel and unforgiving world. Where was Caleb? Had they ambushed him? Was he lying dead in the darkness? The thought sent a wave of nausea through her. She had to find him. She had to protect her children. She stood up, her face streaked with soot, her eyes blazing with a fierce determination. She would not be broken. She would not be defeated. She would survive. For her children. She gathered the triplets close, their small bodies shivering against the chill night air. The fire had died down, leaving behind a smoldering wreck, a testament to the cruelty of men. Winona scanned the horizon, her eyes searching for any sign of Caleb. Nothing. Only the vast, empty expanse of the prairie stretching out before her. She knew she couldn't stay here. They were exposed, vulnerable. Barlow would be back. He wouldn't rest until he had driven her off the land, or worse. She had to find shelter, find help. Where could she go? Dusk Creek was out of the question. It was Barlow's territory. Then, a flicker of movement caught her eye. A lone figure emerged from the darkness, walking towards her. It was Caleb. He moved slowly, deliberately, his face grim, his eyes shadowed. Relief washed over her, so potent it almost brought her to her knees. He was alive. As he drew closer, she saw the blood on his hands, the tear in his shirt. Had been in a fight. A fierce one. He stopped in front of her, his gaze sweeping over the scene of devastation. He took in the smoldering ruins, the frightened children, the look of despair on Winona's face. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. Caleb knelt down beside Thomas, the youngest, and gently wiped the soot from his face. The boy whimpered and clung to him, burying his face in Caleb's rough-spun trousers. Caleb's hand lingered there a moment, a rare display of tenderness. Then he stood up, his face set like granite. He looked at Winona, his eyes burning with a cold, hard light. "Enough," he rasped, his voice low and dangerous. Winona stared at him, confused. "Enough? What do you mean?" Caleb looked out at the horizon, his gaze fixed on some distant point. This ends now." He turned and walked towards his horse, which stood patiently a few yards away. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out something wrapped in oilcloth. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a worn leather pouch. He opened the pouch and poured its contents into his hand, gold coins. He turned back to Winona, his face unreadable. "Take the children. Go to Redemption. It's a town west. There's a stagecoach." Winona's eyes widened. "Redemption? But what about you? What will you do?" Caleb's jaw tightened. "I'm staying. This violence, it stops here. With me." He held out the gold coins to her. "Take them. Go on. Start over." Winona hesitated, torn. She didn't want to leave him. She didn't want to abandon the land, the dream she had clung to for so long. But she knew he was right. Staying here meant certain death, for her and her children. She reached out and took the coins, her fingers brushing against his. A spark, a connection, passed between them. A silent understanding. "Be careful," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Caleb nodded, his gaze unwavering. He wouldn't promise her anything he couldn't deliver. His word was his bond, and his bond was silence. He was drawing a line in the sand, a line that Barlow and his men wouldn't dare cross. He hoped. Caleb watched Winona gather the triplets, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. He saw the fight still burning in her eyes, a flicker of the woman who had faced down Barlow's men with a shotgun. He knew leaving was tearing her apart, but he also knew it was the only way to ensure their survival. He turned away as she started walking, leading the children towards the distant stagecoach route. He couldn't bear to watch them disappear. He had a different path to walk, a darker one. He mounted his horse, the animal sensing the change in him, the shift from protector to something else. He rode towards Dust Creek, the rising sun painting the sky in hues of blooded orange and fiery red. The air was still, heavy with the scent of smoke and the promise of violence. He found Barlow and his men waiting for him at the edge of town, a motley crew of hardened faces and glinting steel. They were sprawled around a makeshift camp, their rifles within easy reach, their eyes narrowed with anticipation. Barlow stepped forward, a sneer twisting his lips. "Well, look what the cat dragged in. Thought you'd be long gone by now, stranger." Caleb didn't reply. He simply sat on his horse, his gaze fixed on Barlow, his face a mask of grim determination. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, broken only by the snorting of horses and the rustling of the wind. "You're a stubborn one, I'll give you that," Barlow continued, his voice laced with menace. "But stubbornness ain't gonna save you now. You interfered where you shouldn't have. Now you're gonna pay the price." Caleb dismounted, the sound of his boots hitting the dusty ground echoing in the stillness. He left his rifle on the saddle, his hands hanging loose at his sides. He wasn't reaching for a gun. This wasn't about a quick draw. This was about something deeper, something more primal. "This ends here, Barlow." Caleb finally spoke, his voice low and gravelly, each word a carefully placed stone. "Leave Winona and her children alone. Leave this land alone." Barlow laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You think you can tell me what to do? You're just one man, against all of us." Caleb's eyes narrowed. "There's always only one man standing when the dust settles." He took a step forward, his movement slow and deliberate, his eyes never leaving Barlow's. The sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long, ominous shadows across the dusty ground. The showdown had begun. The air crackled with tension, a prelude to the storm that was about to break. The fate of Winona, her children, and the land itself hung in the balance, resting on the shoulders of a silent rancher who had finally found his voice. Barlow spat on the ground, a glob of tobacco juice landing inches from Caleb's boot. "That's where you're wrong, stranger. There ain't gonna be no dust settling. You're gonna be face down in the dirt before the sun hits noon." He nodded to his men. 3 of them stepped forward, their rifles raised. The glint of steel reflected the harsh sunlight, a deadly promise hanging in the air. Caleb didn't flinch. He stood his ground, a lone figure against a wall of animosity. He knew he couldn't win a gunfight against so many, but he wasn't planning on a gunfight. As the men raised their rifles, Caleb moved. Not towards them, but towards Barlow. He moved with a speed that belied his size, a blur of motion that caught everyone off guard. He closed the distance in a heartbeat, his hands snaking out and grabbing Barlow by the throat. Barlow gasped, his eyes widening in surprise and fear. He clawed at Caleb's hand, but the grip was like iron. He couldn't breathe. The men with the rifles hesitated. They couldn't shoot without risking hitting Barlow. They lowered their weapons, their faces contorted with indecision. Caleb tightened his grip. Barlow's face turned red, then purple. His eyes bulged. He kicked and struggled, but it was no use. Caleb was too strong. Caleb looked into Barlow's eyes, saw the fear, the desperation, the dawning realization of his own mortality. He felt a surge of anger, a burning desire to end it all right there. This man had terrorized Winona, threatened her children, tried to burn them out of their home. He deserved to die. But then he saw something else in Barlow's eyes. A flicker of regret. A plea for mercy. Or was it just the desperation of a dying man? Caleb hesitated. He could feel Barlow's life slipping away. He could end it all with a simple squeeze. But he couldn't bring himself to do it. He wasn't a killer. He was a protector. With a guttural groan, Caleb released his grip. Barlow collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, his face streaked with sweat and tears. He lay there for a moment, coughing and sputtering, trying to regain his breath. Caleb stepped back, his chest heaving. He looked at Barlow's men, their rifles still lowered, their faces a mixture of confusion and disbelief. "Get him out of here," Caleb said, his voice hoarse. "And don't ever come back. If I see any of you on this land again, I won't be so merciful." The men hesitated, then rushed to Barlow's side, helping him to his feet. They supported him as they led him away, their heads bowed, their tails between their legs. Caleb watched them go, his body trembling with exhaustion. He had spared Barlow's life, but he knew he hadn't won. Not really. Barlow would be back. He was the kind of man who never gave up. But for now, it was enough. He had bought Winona and her children some time. Time to get away, to start over. Time to find their own redemption. Caleb turned and walked back to his horse, his shoulders slumped, his spirit weary. The sun beat down on him, a harsh reminder of the unforgiving nature of the West. He had made a choice, a difficult one, an act of mercy, in a land that offered little mercy. But he could only hope it was the right one. The stagecoach rattled and swayed, a metal beast carving its way through the unforgiving landscape. Winona clutched Thomas tighter, his small body a fragile anchor in a sea of uncertainty. The triplets, usually a boisterous trio, were subdued, their faces pale and drawn. The events at the homestead clung to them like dust, a gritty reminder of the violence they had witnessed. Redemption, the driver had said, was still days away. Days of dust and heat, and the constant fear that Barlow might somehow find them. Winona peered out the window, the endless expanse of prairie blurring past. Caleb's face, etched with determination, flashed in her mind. His silence was a shield, his actions a promise. He had given them a chance, a slim thread of hope in a world that seemed determined to tear them apart. The stage stopped abruptly, throwing Winona forward. "A broken wheel," the driver announced, his voice laced with annoyance. He needed to fix it, and it would take time. Winona felt a familiar wave of panic wash over her. They were exposed, vulnerable. She gathered the triplets and stepped out of the stage, needing to breathe the fresh air, to feel the earth beneath her feet. She led them a short distance away, to a small cluster of scrubby trees offering meager shade. As she sat with them, sharing the last of their water, she noticed a small patch of wildflowers blooming amidst the dry grass. Tiny splashes of color in a monochrome world. They were fragile, delicate, yet they had found a way to thrive in this harsh environment. Winona's gaze softened. She saw a reflection of herself and her children in those flowers. They too had been battered and bruised, but they were still alive, still standing. And maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to bloom again too. She gently touched one of the petals, a small gesture of hope. She would rebuild, she vowed silently. For her children, for Caleb, for herself. She would find a way to make a life in redemption, a life free from fear, a life where her children could laugh and play without looking over their shoulders. The driver called out, announcing that the wheel was fixed. Winona gathered the triplets, her heart a little lighter, her resolve a little stronger. As she climbed back into the stage, she glanced back at the wildflowers, a silent promise blooming in her heart. The seeds of hope had been sown. It was time to nurture them, to help them take root, to build a future from the ashes of the past. And somewhere, in the quiet strength she now carried, was the memory of a silent rancher, a man who had stood between her and the darkness, giving her the chance to find her own redemption. The stage lurched onward, leaving Winona and her triplets inching closer to redemption, each mile a whispered prayer for a future untainted by Barlow's shadow. The wildflowers lingered in her mind, a vibrant promise against the backdrop of dust and hardship. Back at the homestead, Caleb watched the stagecoach disappear over the horizon, a knot of worry twisting in his gut. He knew Barlow wouldn't stay gone for long. He was a festering wound on the land, and wounds needed tending, even if the tending was brutal. He spent the next few days reinforcing the homestead, boarding up windows, sharpening his axe, a grim anticipation settling over him. He wasn't waiting for Barlow, he was preparing. The land itself seemed to hold its breath, the wind whispering secrets through the tall grasses, secrets of survival, of resilience, of the enduring spirit of the West. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Caleb sat on the porch, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. A lone coyote howled in the distance, a mournful sound that echoed the loneliness in his heart. He thought of Winona and her children, their faces etched with fear and exhaustion. He hoped they were safe, that they had found some measure of peace in redemption. He heard the sound of approaching hooves, the rhythmic beat growing louder and louder. He stood up, his hand instinctively reaching for his rifle. But it wasn't Barlow. It was an old woman, her face weathered and lined, her eyes as sharp as a hawk's. She rode a sturdy mule, her posture erect, her presence commanding. "Name's Martha," she said, her voice raspy but firm. "Heard tell there was trouble out here. Figured you could use some help." Caleb studied her for a moment, his gaze unwavering. He saw no fear in her eyes, only a quiet determination. He lowered his rifle, a flicker of hope igniting within him. "I could," he admitted, his voice low. "Barlow will be back." Martha nodded, dismounting from her mule. "Then we'll be ready for him. This land ain't gonna be bullied by the likes of him." Together, they prepared. Martha, with her knowledge of herbs and her sharp wit, and Caleb with his strength and his unwavering resolve. They were an unlikely pair, but they shared a common bond, a love for the land, and a fierce determination to protect it. As the days turned into weeks, they waited, the silence broken only by the wind and the occasional cry of a hawk. The land held its breath, waiting for the storm to break. And when it finally did, Caleb and Martha would be ready. For the wind knew their names, and the wind carried their story, a story of courage, of resilience, and of the enduring spirit of the West.